On the summer solstice, at the exact moment the sun breaks the horizon, its first light travels through a precise stone alignment at Stonehenge and lands at the center of the monument, exactly as it has for roughly 5,000 years. The stones did not move. The sun did not change its path. Whoever built this arrangement calculated, with no instruments beyond patient observation, exactly where to place several ton blocks of rock, so that one specific morning of the year would feel unmistakably different from every other. On the other side of the planet, in the jungles of Mexico, sunlight strikes the staircase of a Maya pyramid on the equinox and creates the unmistakable illusion of a serpent slithering down the steps, vertebra by vertebra, toward the earth. In Egypt, temple gateways were built in the precise shape of a hieroglyph, meaning horizon, the exact point where the sun was believed to cross between this world and the next. 3 civilizations, 3 separate continents, no contact whatsoever with one another, and yet the same underlying idea arrived at independently. Certain places, at certain moments, become doorways. Today, a very different version of that idea circulates online. That ancient monuments were not symbolic at all, but literal machinery, stargates built or activated by something beyond ordinary human civilization, and that modern science, NASA in particular, has quietly confirmed it. That claim deserves serious scrutiny, not dismissal and not endorsement, because the actual history connecting these dots is stranger, older, and more interesting than the internet version usually allows. But why does this specific framing feel so plausible to so many people in the first place? It's worth asking, before going any further, why this particular framing has spread so widely. Part of the answer is almost embarrassingly simple. Science fiction borrowed the word gateway or Stargate because ancient religious architecture already used exactly that concept, long before any television writer touched the idea. The metaphor did not originate in modern entertainment and then get retroactively applied to ancient ruins. It is closer to the reverse. Ancient religious language about thresholds and crossing points predates the fiction by thousands of years, which is precisely why the fictional framing felt so instantly believable to so many people encountering it. So how do we actually separate the genuine history here from the speculation built on top of it? This investigation is going to follow 3 separate threads at once. Real architecture, built by real ancient civilizations to represent gateways between worlds. Real, well-documented human experiences of altered consciousness that ancient religions interpreted as travel beyond ordinary reality. And real, modern physics that genuinely does use the word portal, though not in the way most viral posts suggest. Where these threads tangle together into the modern ancient Stargate theory, we'll examine that too, clearly and without exaggeration in either direction. There is currently no evidence that physical Stargates existed on Earth, that any ancient monument physically transported people through space, or that extraterrestrials used these structures for any purpose. What there is, conclusively, is a worldwide pattern of human beings building elaborate architecture specifically to represent the idea of crossing a threshold into the divine. That pattern alone is worth a careful look. So where does that pattern actually begin? Let's start with the architecture itself, because long before anyone used the word Stargate, ancient builders were already obsessed with gates. Stonehenge itself was not built in a single moment of inspiration. Construction unfolded over more than 1,000 years, beginning around 3000 BCE, with a circular earthwork of banks and ditches, with wooden posts likely standing where the great stones would eventually rise. Only later, in stages, did the massive sarsen stones and smaller blue stones familiar today take their final, carefully calculated positions. A monument this famous for its precision was, in other words, centuries in the making before it ever achieved that precision. Stonehenge itself is also only one piece of a far larger regional pattern. The nearby timber monument known as Woodhenge shares the exact same solstice alignment. Across the water in Ireland, the passage tomb at Newgrange was built so precisely that dawn light on the winter solstice travels down a long stone corridor and illuminates the inner chamber for a few brief minutes, an effect that required calculating the sun's lowest annual angle, centuries before anyone had writing to record the math behind it. A specific moment, a specific angle of light, a specific chamber deliberately built to receive it, repeated independently at multiple sites across the same general region, then echoed again, separately, on entirely different continents thousands of miles away. That repetition is the first thread this investigation needs to take seriously. Did this same fixation with precise gateways appear outside the British Isles, or was this a regional quirk? In ancient Egypt, the towering twin-walled entrance to every major temple, known as a pylon, was not simply decorative. Egyptian theology explicitly modeled its shape on the hieroglyph for Ekhet, meaning horizon, literally a depiction of the sun rising and setting between two hills. Walking through a temple pylon meant walking through a built representation of the exact point where the sun, and by extension the human soul, was believed to cross between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. Was this purely a design choice, or did it shape how the temple was actually used? The ritual use of this architecture went further than passive symbolism. On festival days, priests carried a statue of the temple's resident god out through the pylon's central gateway in formal procession, with Egyptian texts describing the god as rising through the structure, exactly as the sun rose between the horizon hills it represented. Internal staircases inside the pylon's twin towers allowed the pharaoh himself to climb up and appear at the top during state ceremonies, presenting himself to crowds below in the same visual position the sun occupied at dawn. Did this gateway symbolism stop at the temple wall, or did it shape Egyptian belief even further, into death itself? This same gateway logic extended directly into Egyptian beliefs about death itself, not merely temple worship. Egyptian funerary texts describe the soul's journey through the Duat, a perilous realm the dead had to cross through a series of distinct gates, each one guarded by a specific deity, demanding the correct password or precise ritual knowledge before granting passage onward. Tomb walls were frequently painted with detailed depictions of exactly these gates, intended to prepare and guide the deceased through a structured sequence of thresholds on the long way to final judgment. The architecture standing above ground and the theology describing what waited below it were, in this sense, mirror images of the very same underlying idea. A doorway shaped like a piece of sacred writing, designed so that the physical act of simply walking through it reenacted a cosmic event. This was not subtle symbolism reserved only for priests. It was architecture as theology, visible to every single person who ever entered a major Egyptian temple. It's worth pausing on why the threshold itself, rather than the destination beyond it, became the focus of so much ancient design. A doorway is the one piece of architecture every visitor must physically pass through, making it the natural place to encode meaning that an entire community would experience bodily, not just intellectually. Crossing a threshold is inherently transitional. You are neither fully outside nor fully inside, briefly suspended between two states. Ancient builders across multiple, unconnected traditions appear to have recognized that this in-between moment was uniquely suited to representing a passage between worlds, which may help explain why so many cultures converged on the same architectural solution, despite never sharing a single idea between them. Did this same instinct appear independently elsewhere, or was Egypt simply unusual? In Mesopotamia, a similar idea took the form of the ziggurat, a massive stepped tower at the heart of cities like Babylon. The grandest of these, known as Etemenanki, carried a name that translates directly as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. Mesopotamians explicitly understood these structures as physical connectors between the divine and human realms, with the temple at the summit serving as the point of contact, and the climb itself functioning as ritual passage from one realm toward the other. This is very likely the same structure that later inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, a tower whose builders explicitly intended to reach unto heaven. Whether or not that specific narrative connection holds in every detail, the underlying ambition it describes matches the ziggurat's documented purpose precisely. Humans building upward, deliberately, to physically narrow the distance between their world and a divine one above it. Did this same gateway impulse appear only at the top of these towering structures, or further down too? Mesopotamian cities reinforced this same gateway logic at ground level as well, not only at the summit of a ziggurat. City and palace gates were frequently flanked by colossal stone guardian figures, part bull or lion and part human, intended to protect the literal threshold between the ordinary world outside and the sacred or royal space within. The message carried by both the towering ziggurat above and the heavily guarded gateway at ground level was essentially the same. Certain boundaries were not casual lines on a map, but meaningful crossings that required acknowledgement, protection, and ritual respect. A tower built, by name and by design, to be a literal connecting point between heaven and earth, not because anyone believed it would transport a person's body upward, but because the structure itself was meant to embody that connection in stone. So how far back does this same basic instinct go? Further than agriculture itself, it turns out. At Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, hunter-gatherers with no permanent settlements anywhere nearby built monumental stone enclosures more than 11,000 years ago. Thousands of years before farming existed anywhere in the region. The site's massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, are arranged in circular formations that mainstream archaeologists generally interpret as ceremonial gathering spaces, built specifically around the human impulse to mark, formalize, and ritually approach something considered sacred. Excavators have noted that several of the carved pillars feature animal reliefs positioned as though guarding or framing the enclosed circular space, suggesting these were never ordinary buildings, but deliberately set apart ritual ground from the very beginning. Göbekli Tepe is also no longer considered an isolated anomaly. Ongoing regional excavation, sometimes referred to collectively as the Taş Tepeler Project, has identified more than a dozen similar monumental sites scattered across the same general area of southeastern Turkey, suggesting this was not a single, unrepeatable feat by one unusually ambitious community, but a shared regional tradition of building set-apart sacred space, practiced by multiple separate groups working independently of one another. Hunter-gatherers, with no permanent settlements and no written language of any kind, organizing enormous cooperative labor specifically to build a place deliberately set apart from ordinary, everyday space. Before cities, before writing, before farming, humans were already building thresholds. The pattern continues across the Atlantic in Maya ceremonial complexes, where pyramids were deliberately oriented so that, twice a year at the equinoxes, sunlight falling across the staircase edges creates the visual effect of a serpent descending from the temple summit to the earth below, at sites such as Chichen Itza, where thousands of visitors still gather specifically to witness this engineered illusion. The serpent itself was no incidental choice of imagery. It represented Kukulkan, a major deity associated with both the sky and the act of descending toward the human world, meaning the illusion was not simply decorative, but a deliberate, recurring reenactment of divine contact, scheduled with calendar precision. Maya cosmology describes certain structures and ritual spaces as literal access points connecting the heavens, the earthly world, and the underworld. A three-layered cosmos that needed a physical, ceremonial location where all three layers could be symbolically reached at once. This axis concept appears throughout Maya religious art as a great world tree, its roots reaching into the underworld and its branches supporting the sky, with temple pyramids functioning as physical stand-ins for that same cosmic structure. Maya rulers were frequently depicted performing rituals at the base of these pyramids, specifically intended to open communication with ancestors and gods inhabiting the other two cosmic layers, treating the temple itself as the fixed point where that communication became possible. A separate civilization, isolated by an ocean from Egypt and Mesopotamia, arriving independently at the same essential architecture, a built structure functioning as a deliberate crossing point between cosmic realms. What makes this pattern even more striking is the sheer technical precision behind it. None of these civilizations had telescopes, written mathematics in the modern sense, or any instrument beyond patient generational observation. Yet Stonehenge's solstice alignment, the Maya equinox serpent effect, and Egyptian temples oriented toward specific stellar risings all required tracking the sky's slow, repeating patterns across years or decades before a single stone was finally set in its calculated position. This was not guesswork refined by trial and error alone. At Karnak in Egypt, certain temple axes appear aligned with the rising of specific stars rather than the sun, while others were oriented toward solar events, much like Stonehenge, suggesting Egyptian priest astronomers maintained long-term observational records, sophisticated enough to distinguish between different categories of celestial alignment and apply each deliberately, depending on a temple's specific religious purpose and the particular deity it served. The underlying message across every one of these sites is consistent. Getting the alignment exactly right mattered enormously, because the ritual power of the gateway depended on it actually corresponding to a real astronomical event, not an approximate or symbolic one. If unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, kept inventing the same basic concept of a sacred threshold, and kept investing this same enormous technical effort into making sure it lined up precisely with the sky, the next question almost asks itself: was this purely architectural symbolism, or was something else going on at these sites that made the idea of crossing over feel real rather than merely decorative? To answer that, we need to look directly at what ancient people reported actually happening inside these spaces. Across cultures with no plausible contact, religious and shamanic traditions describe practitioners entering altered states of consciousness, frequently induced through repetitive drumming, fasting, specific body postures, or the ritual use of plant-based substances anthropologists call entheogens, a term meaning roughly generating the god within, and experiencing this state as literal travel, the practitioner's spirit leaving the body, crossing into another realm, and returning with information, healing, or guidance. Archaeological and anthropological research has documented this pattern on essentially every inhabited continent, from Siberian and Arctic shamanic traditions to ritual practitioners in the ancient Americas, including Casas Grandes communities of the American Southwest active between roughly 1200 and 1450 CE, who appear to have used tobacco-based intoxication combined with a specific ritual body posture, accompanied by rapid drumming or rattling, to reliably induce a documented, repeatable sensation of vertigo and soul flight. How could researchers possibly confirm a subjective, internal experience like this actually happened the same way across cultures? Researchers studying painted pottery from these same communities have identified recurring imagery interpreted as depictions of spirit guides and animated objects believed to accompany practitioners during these trance journeys, suggesting an entire material culture organized around supporting and interpreting the experience. A repeatable, biologically real human experience, occurring entirely independently in cultures with no contact whatsoever, yet consistently described using nearly identical language, leaving the body, crossing a boundary, traveling somewhere else, and eventually returning. This same pattern wasn't confined to small-scale shamanic societies. Ancient Greece built an entire institution around it at Delphi, consulted by kings, generals, and ordinary citizens for centuries, where a priestess, known as the Pythia, delivered prophecies while in a documented altered state, seated above a chasm in the temple's inner chamber that ancient writers described as emitting vapors believed to induce her trance. Modern geological studies have identified fault lines beneath the site, capable of releasing naturally occurring gases, including ethylene, consistent with these ancient accounts of vapor-induced trance, offering a rare case where the physical mechanism behind a reported altered state can be partially examined directly, rather than only inferred from ritual or testimony. So is there any way to study what was actually happening inside the minds of these practitioners, rather than relying only on ancient testimony? Neuroanthropological research using modern brain imaging techniques has found that these trance states correspond to measurable, consistent patterns of brain activity, suggesting shamanic trance reflects a genuine biological capacity of the human brain rather than pure cultural invention layered onto nothing at all. According to mainstream anthropology, this is the most likely route of doorway to another world language across so many unrelated traditions. Not a shared external destination, but a shared internal human capacity for a specific, definable kind of altered experience, interpreted through whatever cosmology each culture already possessed. According to this tradition, then, ancient gateways may have served two reinforcing purposes at once: physically marking the location where a community gathered to undergo these altered states, and symbolically representing, in permanent stone, the threshold crossing those altered states were believed to achieve. That still leaves one major thread of the modern Stargate story untouched, and it's the thread that, unlike everything discussed so far, comes wrapped in real, peer-reviewed physics rather than archaeology or anthropology. So what does actual modern space science say about portals, and how did that language end up here? In 2008, and again in subsequent NASA-funded research, physicists studying Earth's magnetosphere identified something they genuinely, officially, call a magnetic portal. The phenomenon, known more formally as magnetic reconnection or a flux transfer event, occurs when Earth's magnetic field lines and the Sun's magnetic field lines cross and briefly merge, opening a temporary, roughly Earth-sized cylindrical channel through which charged solar particles can flow directly from the Sun's atmosphere into Earth's magnetosphere. Space physicist David Seebeck, describing the discovery at a 2008 plasma physics workshop, compared the resulting structure to a giant rolling pin lying flat along the boundary between the two planets' magnetic fields, growing and eventually breaking free to spiral around Earth's wider magnetic environment. The particles that flow through these reconnection events are also directly responsible for the aurora, the shimmering polar lights visible from the ground whenever this very real, very technical process happens to be especially active. NASA's own press materials describe these as opening dozens of times each day, each lasting only minutes, located high above Earth's surface in near space rather than anywhere on the ground. Multiple spacecraft, including NASA's fleet of 5 Themis probes and the European Space Agency's 4 cluster satellites, were specifically positioned to surround these reconnection zones and directly measure the particles and magnetic fields flowing through them, confirming the phenomenon is real, repeatable science rather than speculation, and considerably more common than physicists had originally suspected. A genuine NASA-confirmed phenomenon, using the literal word portal in official agency press materials, describing an invisible, temporary channel for charged particles 93 million miles from Earth, with absolutely no connection to travel, teleportation, or any monument anywhere on the ground. This is precisely where the modern Stargate theory does its most effective sleight of hand, borrowing entirely real, NASA-sourced terminology about subatomic particle flow and silently substituting it into claims about human-scale travel through ancient stone structures, without ever establishing any actual link between the two. Layer on top of that one more ingredient: a long, complicated history of the word Stargate itself, circulating through real declassified government programs and popular fiction simultaneously, until the line between them blurred for many casual readers. The CIA genuinely operated a classified program named Project Stargate from the 1970s through 1995, investigating whether human subjects could perform remote viewing, meaning psychically perceiving distant locations without physically traveling there. The program passed through several different agencies and code names over its 2 decades of operation, at one point testing whether a subject could describe a secret Soviet facility's internal layout based purely on a map coordinate and intense concentration. After internal and independent review found insufficient evidence the technique provided usable intelligence, the program was formally terminated in 1995. It involved no actual portals, no monuments, and no travel of any kind, purely claimed perception at a distance, ultimately deemed scientifically unsupported by the very government bodies that funded it. A real, declassified program, sharing a name with science fiction by coincidence rather than design, investigating something entirely unrelated to physical gateways. That coincidence of naming collided decades later with the massively popular Stargate science fiction franchise, beginning with a 1994 film and expanding into a long-running television series, which depicted literal alien-built portal devices hidden within ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian monuments on Earth, explicitly borrowing real archaeological sites and real mythological names for its fictional premise. Some viewers, encountering both threads online without the historical context separating them, concluded the fiction must be based on suppressed fact, rather than recognizing that the fiction's creators had simply done the same thing this documentary is doing. Noticing that ancient gateway architecture already looked remarkably like science fiction, and building an entertaining story around that observation. Where does this leave the most extreme version of the modern claim that secret portal technology is not only real, but actively in use today? This is also where the most recent and most explicitly speculative layer enters the picture. Individuals describing themselves as whistleblowers from an alleged secret space program, some featured on independent media platforms, claiming first-hand experience traveling through portal technology connected to ancient sites, including descriptions of ancient stone structures in the Middle East allegedly housing dormant gateway devices. These claims, regardless of how emotionally presented, have never been independently verified by any credentialed scientific body, involve no public physical evidence of any kind, and in some cases directly echo plot details from the same science fiction franchise they claim predates them, including specific terminology and even character archetypes. There is currently no evidence that any whistleblower claim regarding portal technology, secret space programs, or extraterrestrial use of ancient monuments has been independently verified. These remain personal testimonies, evaluated by mainstream science as unsupported, not confirmed history. So, gathering every thread examined so far, what does the evidence actually show? And where does genuine uncertainty remain? It conclusively shows that ancient civilizations across the world, entirely independently, built monumental architecture explicitly designed to represent thresholds between human and divine reality, using astronomy, geometry, and symbolic form with remarkable sophistication. It conclusively shows that altered states of consciousness producing experiences described as crossing over or traveling beyond the body are real, measurable, and documented across cultures with no possible contact with one another. And it conclusively shows that modern space physics has identified a genuine phenomenon scientists themselves chose to nickname a portal, entirely unconnected to any structure on Earth's surface. But why would so many unrelated cultures land on the same threshold-crossing idea in the first place? What remains genuinely open to interpretation, rather than settled fact, is why this same threshold-crossing concept appears so persistently and so similarly across unconnected cultures separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years. Mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists generally conclude this reflects shared features of human cognition, ritual psychology, and the universal experience of watching the sun and stars move predictably across the sky. A sufficient, naturalistic explanation requiring no contact between ancient civilizations and no undiscovered technology of any kind. Some alternative researchers suggest the consistency runs deeper than coincidence, arguing that genuinely altered states of consciousness, however they were chemically or ritually induced, may represent a real, if poorly understood, human capacity for perceiving something beyond ordinary physical reality, regardless of whether the structures built around that capacity functioned as anything more than ceremonial focal points. This is a substantially more modest claim than literal stargates, and a noticeably different one from secret space program testimony, even though popular media frequently blends all three together as though they were a single argument. This particular thread, unlike the others, has recently moved back into legitimate clinical research rather than staying confined to either ancient ritual or internet speculation. A controlled study conducted at Harvard in the 1960s, often called the Good Friday experiment, gave theology students psilocybin in a religious setting, and documented that many reported what they described as profound, lasting mystical experiences that some participants continued to rate, decades later, among the most meaningful events of their lives. Contemporary researchers at major universities have since revisited this work using modern neuroimaging, generally treating these reported experiences as genuine, measurable psychological events worth serious study. While stopping well short of concluding they constitute literal travel to another physical realm. A scientific bridge connecting the oldest religious practices on Earth to some of the newest clinical research being conducted today, treating the human experience itself, rather than any external destination, as the thing worth rigorously studying. What the evidence does not show, and what mainstream science does not currently accept in any form, is that any of these monuments physically functioned as a gateway moving matter through space, that NASA's confirmed magnetic portals have any connection whatsoever to ancient architecture, or that any verified extraterrestrial contact involving these sites has ever taken place. So where does that leave the actual mystery this investigation set out to examine? Return, for a moment, to the three images this episode opened with. Sunlight crossing Stonehenge at the precise solstice moment, a serpent of light descending a Maya staircase, and a temple gateway built in the exact shape of the word for horizon. None of these required alien intervention, secret technology, or unverified testimony to exist. They required patient astronomical observation, immense cooperative labor, and a shared human conviction, repeated independently across every inhabited continent, that certain places and certain moments could be made to matter more than others. Perhaps the real discovery here isn't a hidden portal at all, but something almost more remarkable for being so thoroughly human. Across deserts, jungles, plains, and river valleys, with no shared language and no possibility of contact, ancient people kept arriving at the same conclusion: that certain places and certain moments, properly marked and properly approached, could feel like more than ordinary space and ordinary time. Whether that feeling reflects genuine contact with something beyond human experience, or simply reflects the full, strange depth of human consciousness encountering the night sky, the rising sun, and its own capacity for altered states, remains a question neither archaeology nor physics has fully closed. Maybe it never fully will. What we can say with confidence is this: long before anyone imagined a machine that could open a door to another world, humans were already building doors, carving doors, climbing doors, and walking through doors, convinced that something genuinely sacred waited just on the other side. Whether that conviction was symbolic, neurological, or something we still don't have adequate language for, is perhaps the oldest and most honest mystery of all.